All right, welcome everybody. It is just after 4 o'clock on the East Coast, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time and welcome you to the look at the 2020-2021 NAGC State of the States in Gifted Education Report. My name is David Cutler. I'm the Director of Government Relations and Public Affairs with NAGC. I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar today. Just a couple notes. We will have time at the end of the webinar for questions. And if you would take a look at your screen, there's a little box that says Q&A. If you type your question into that, both I and our presenter, Jaret, will see those questions. And I believe that Jaret will also stop throughout his presentation if there are any pertinent questions that need answering. He'll take a look at those. We are recording today's presentation, today's webinar, and a link will be emailed to you in about 2 to 3 business days for you to access this recording. If you are not familiar with the latest edition of the State of the States report, please feel free to use the QR code on your screen, scan it, and that will take you to our webpage at nagc.org that has the free State of the States report for you to download. So I'll leave this here for just a moment while I introduce today's presenter. Today's presenter is Dr. Jaret Hodges. He is an assistant professor at the University of North Texas. He earned his master's degree at the University of Houston, doctorate at Purdue University, and was a postdoctoral researcher at Duke University. His research interests include underrepresented populations in gifted education, rural gifted education, and gifted education policy. He also has an interest in promoting open science practices and the use of computer programming in education research. And Jaret was also part of the research team on this edition of the State of the States report, and I believe the last one as well in 2018, 2019. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce and turn things over to our presenter, Dr. Jaret Hodges.
Welcome, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. This will be a little different if you attended the NAGC presentation. So these kind of after NAGC presentations give you a little bit more intimate look at the State of the States. I kind of pull the curtain back a little bit. I talk about some of the process that went in there, some of the insights, some of the more informal aspects of the State of the State report that we might not cover in the NAGC presentation. So if you went to the NAGC presentation and you saw the State of the States reports, you'll see some things that are familiar, but the big difference is kind of the manner in which I'll discuss it. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to get things started on the presentation. So let's get that up and rolling. So again, I did this with my co-authors, both also professors at the University of North Texas, Dr. Ann Wren and Dr. Rachel Moon. This is the second time we did this report. So for those of you who were around or got to see me then, you already got to see me present this once. This will be the second time to do it. And the second time that we did this gave us a little bit more insight, a little bit more understanding, and not just of the report and some of the questions and some of the themes that were brought through the report, but also some of the nuance in data collection. And that's one of the things that I'm going to talk about as well. A few acknowledgements. First, I want to acknowledge David. Again, he's the NAGC rep. He's one of the ones who helped get this going, get things rolling, kind of the glue of the whole report. As well, we had Maria and Mark. They were from the Council of State Directors. They provided a lot of advice, a lot of insight, and a lot of help in the report. And of course, all the state directors and those from the states themselves, like involved in gifted ed, we appreciate all your response. We appreciate all your support. And 2 doctoral students that we want to point out that helped us this time were Ashley Shin and Rebecca Johnson. Rebecca will be leaving us, sadly. She'll be a postdoc at Purdue. We're happy for her, but we're sad that she's going to be going. So for those in Indiana, maybe you'll get to meet Becky firsthand. They helped us with the report. And finally, Jane Clarenbach gave us some insight and some clarity throughout the report, and we appreciate all of them. I just want to acknowledge those people because one of the things about the State of the States report, there's a lot of folks that are involved in putting it together. So it's not just the respondents. It's a lot on them too, not just the 3 of us, me, Ann, and Rachel, there's a lot of auxiliary folks who kind of share the burden on putting this report. So when you think of the state of the state's report, and when you read through it, you have to consider in mind that this is a huge collective effort on the part of the NAGC to produce this report. So a little bit about the report. Again, this is the second time that we did it. And there are a few changes of this year that I really want to highlight. We expanded the report this year, and we expanded to also include the Department of Defense, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the US Virgin Islands. So we expanded to include those. So last year, or the year previously, was a big year because we were able to include all 50 states and Washington, D.C. This year, we worked to include all 4 of those. We were unable to include Guam and the US Virgin Islands. And that's one area that we hope to include in the upcoming report, or the following report is those 2 territories. But we did get a response from Puerto Rico. And the main one that folks might have an interest in is the Department of Defense, is we were able to get their response. The other thing that we did is we kind of modified some of the questions and helped streamline them. We took some of the feedback from the previous report and some of the previous comments, like especially where some of the things were maybe confusing, and we edited the question. But one thing that I want to point out, there's a little bit of give and take there on some of the edits and additions. As for some of you who might have taken the State of the State survey, it's long, so you can't add too much. People have a lot to do. So that's one give and take. And the other area is editing questions. If you edit too much, it's difficult to compare one year to the other. So we have to balance that. So when you're thinking to yourself, well, I didn't like this question back in 2018, 2019, that one, why is it still here in 2020, 2021? Because there's a balance that we have to approach and that we have to take on designing the survey and building it. We have to keep it similar enough that we can talk about changes over time, but we also have to modify it to make it better. So that's one thing to consider too as I go through the report. Again, the report includes all 50 states and the NDC, including the DoD and Puerto Rico. And one thing that's different too that I'll talk about a little more is the missingness was way down. We really were able to get a lot more complete responses this time. And again, in all cases, the person who filled out the response is considered the representative of that state DOE. So the respondents, and sometimes that representative was a person directly associated with gifted education who was the representative or person responsible for gifted education within the state. And at other states, it might be someone who is maybe adjacent to it or has it under their umbrella. For example, you might have a director of special education filling it out. Or you might have a secondary curriculum or filling it out, or someone who's involved. Like say, for example, a state that might not have gifted education services, but they do have dual credit and they do have dual enrollment. In that case, the state might deem that gifted education services then fall under the proxy of the secondary director, and that person filled out the report for us. But in one case or not in one case, but in all cases, I want to reiterate that the respondents are the representative of the state. So again, a little bit about the methods to kind of give you guys an idea of what we did. Invitations rolled out in April of 2022, and the final responses came in right at the tail end of August, early September. It took a little bit to get some folks. And usually the way that responses work out and how data is collected, there's a big chunk of states that we get, towards like the beginning, middle-ish, like right around when we ask the request to due date, probably about, we'll say 30 of the 50, or maybe 35 of the 50. And then we have about 15 that take a little more coaxing, a little more support. And then we get 10. And it's usually about 5 or so who take a little extra time. So that when we say data collected was between April and September, we don't mean they came in like trickled in all through. What that really means is the vast majority of states came in kind of all at once. And then we had a few kind of ones that needed help. And in some cases, we provided help, and what help would involve would be Ashley or Becky working with them. Again, like for those who might have done it, the survey was completed online. This is a Qualtrics survey. And we had 53 respondents. So again, to reiterate, it's the 50 states, DC, Department of Defense, and Puerto Rico. So I want to talk about the issue of non-response, because this is one thing that comes up regularly, or we get questions about. What does it mean when we don't get a response to a question? The main thing is not all questions apply to all respondents. Like, say, for example, I'll use a state that doesn't have any mandates for gifted education are not necessarily going to have funding associated for gifted education. Or they might not have identification mandates. So if a state says we don't have any mandates, it's all determined by the LEA. Well, it goes to reason then that if they don't respond to the question asking them what they require, or what they require as part of their identification, that non-response is not necessarily because maybe they didn't know or anything. It could be because they said, well, we didn't have any here and we don't have any there. The other thing to think of too, a lack of response doesn't necessarily indicate absence of policy. So what do I mean by that? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this once we get in, and I'll give you a little preview. Long story short, this past year was one interesting phenomenon, which was a lot of turnover at the State Department and a lot of unfilled vacancies or associated with GT. And just because someone didn't know doesn't mean that there was not a policy. And there were examples of that, which I'll use an example where, say, someone indicated, we don't offer this, or we don't have, I'll say, dual enrollment. Our state does not allow it, it's not allowed. You can go to their website and find that it is allowed, that the state supports it and responds it. But again, we have to take the response from the states at face value. And one thing to think about is not necessarily, oh, this report is wrong, this is incorrect. A better way to think about it in terms of, we'll say, advocacy, is that the person who is associated with gifted education at the state level just might not be aware of it yet. And that awareness might be not because they don't care about GT, it could be because they just started at the position. That's one thing to think about too. Like the next thing, lack of response might indicate a lack of knowledge. And then the other one is lack of response might indicate lack of interest in responding. That kind of ties in with the first one, like, well, we don't have this, we're not responding. And one thing to think, and I'm going to talk about more of this, each of these questions, even though they're fairly specific and it might seem that the answer to them is obvious, it depends on who's reading the question sometimes. I'll use one that we kind of face a lot, which is the difference between determined by the LEA and yes. Like, does your state, I'll ask this, you could ask two states, does your state have gifted education? You could have state one that has no policy at the state level, say, well, some states, our districts are allowed to have gifted education. So they do, it's determined by the LEA. And you could have another state say, well, because the state doesn't say so, then no, we don't have it. So there is a little bit of interpretation. We try to catch that when we refine the questions and we try to narrow that in, but I just want to make you guys aware of that as well. So here's how the report is organized. The first part was the state education overview. The second part was where we looked at and asked questions about the definition of gifted. The third part was information about the gifted student population. This is a lot of demographic information. And one thing to say, I'll say a little bit about this because I don't necessarily cover it in the slides, that we faced last year was people looking at the Office for Civil Rights and versus the Office for Civil Rights reporting versus the state's reporting. So this demographic question, I want to preface this, when you look at the report, depends on when it was answered. And for those of you who are at the state level or even have worked in a district, know enrollments at the district sometimes depends on when it is counted. So for example, if the state does enrollment in October, it could look different than a state who reports enrollment numbers from a count in February. So one of the things that makes things a little tricky with kind of comparing from state to state to state to state is that when the count occurs varies across states. The next section looks at program and services for gifted students and related policies. Then we have personnel and training requirements, factors impacting gifted services, funding, accountability, and themes across the states and future directions. I'm also going to talk about 3 other things in this report too. I'm going to talk about what we're deemed 3 big issues, which is ESSA and its effect, a big one, which was the effect of COVID, and finally, equity and what states are doing to address equity. So the first area looks at the state education agency overview. And this in this section of the report, we're asking, what is the state education agency doing? What resources are they applying to gifted education? Are there advocacy groups at the state level? This is kind of in a way to get overview of like the tail or the teeth and tail of the states. What are they doing and how many people are there doing it? So I've done 2 things here. You're going to see the first one is going to be the numbers from this year, and right after it I put the numbers from last year just to kind of give you an idea, and I want to talk about some of the differences. For those of you who are comparing the report, I want to highlight something important to consider. So if we look, it looks very similar from the previous year. The big one is providing technical assistance. That's the big thing that the states are doing. They provide tech. And if you're here in Texas, what does that mean for here? For example, for those here, it means your regions. You'll probably go to some training at the region or some webinar is held by the region. And that's something pretty synonymous with the way that the state supports gifted education services. Another one is responding to parents' questions. That's another big area of focus. One that's not is, as you can see, is always on the end, and you'll see it pretty consistently, are committees and task force and information to the state legislature. I always found that really interesting that as far as a service provided by the SEA, providing information to the legislature, the folks who are making policy, is usually like on the bottom of the list of what they are doing. Now, if you were to compare from last year, you might notice a little difference. Like you say, well, responding to parental questions is number 2. Providing, you'll notice that some of the numbers and maybe some of the order is different. But one thing I want to point out and highlight when comparing last year's report to this year's report is last year or 2 years ago's report was in the middle of COVID. And we had an issue with responses, with some people saying, you know what, I can't respond anymore. We've got a lot going on here. So there was more missingness in that previous report. This year, we had a more complete. So for example, we had 48 respondents, and this one we had 51. So 3 additional states responded. So that accounts for a little bit of the difference. And also there is some variance, depends on who's being asked. I want you guys to remember that there were a lot of more vacancies this past year. So some of the institutional knowledge might have collectively left GT. The next portion of it looked at the definition of gifted identification. And before that, let me get to the Q&A. Oh, I'll be able to talk about that a little more, like with funding. Yeah, we have a section on funding, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Let me grab a quick drink. A little bit of water. The next thing, the section that we looked at were state definitions of gifted and the usage of that definition, the state requirements, and the information about universal screening process. And one thing, again, that I'm going to highlight and that you're going to see, because I've got this year's areas included in the state definition and last year's, you'll notice that there's not a lot of difference between the two. The primary way that states define gifted, the big chunk, are advanced intellectual ability, academic performance, and creativity. That is how a lot of states. So when you were to ask, we'll say, how do the majority of states identify gifted? What is giftedness in the United States? If someone were to ask you, what is giftedness? And we were to look at some like majority response across the states, we'd say in the United States, we can say that giftedness is advanced intellectual, a child's advanced intellectual ability, their performance, and their creativity. That's where you're going to see if you were to look at. And if you look at the previous year, it's almost virtually identical. There's not a lot, there hasn't been a lot of changes in the definitions of giftedness going on. There's been a few things that have gone on in some of the states. Like, for example, there's been some task forces in some of the states. There's been some new legislation put forth in some of the states, but some of the nuts and bolts of giftedness, like what is or who is gifted and what does that mean when they say they are gifted, is very similar. So you're able to see your specific state responded within the report. One thing that I'm avoiding this time, one thing that I learned, is I'm avoiding talking about states specifically this time. Last time I talked about states, specific examples of states. I'm trying to avoid that this time, like using specificity. In the report itself, you can see your state's exact response. So we have information included on how the question and the exact response from the state within the report that David linked. So you can find that there. One thing that might be a good idea, or that I recommend, just to kind of give a little insight for yourself and put these numbers in context for those of you in different states, is follow that link, open up that report, and as I'm going through it, you'll see I'm going along with the report. You can kind of follow along. The responses are in the appendix. You can open up into the appendix and you can see exactly how your state responded there. So again, just like in the 2018-2019, the big area of ways that students are defined as giftedness is advanced intellectual ability, creativity, academic ability, and performance. And why is that? Probably, if you had to ask me, my personal, those are easy. You can measure them on a test easier. Like, it's easier to measure on a test, like a standardized test, than say musical ability, probably a little, or visual arts ability. Some of those are less or more likely to be qualitatively assessed. So here's what I was getting at before, which is requirements regarding identification methods. 10 states said it was required. 9 said it's not required. Majority say determined by the LEA. That's another big theme. And if you were here for the report last year, one of the big themes that we talked about, and it's the same as this year, is gifted education in the United States and across the State of the States reports. You'll see this consistent theme. Determined by the LEA might as well be linked right to gifted education. Individuals, school districts have a lot of control over gifted education. Many states take it, even though they might mandate and they might say you are required to identify, you are required to provide services, how that identification is done, what those services look like, depend on the LEA, depend on the school district. So in that essence, that's one thing that we think about a lot in scholarship in academia. When we look at gifted education, sometimes it's very important to talk about how your students were identified. Like when you have a paper talking about a gifted education population, it's really important to talk about how they were identified as gifted, because that helps us understand, because what it means to be gifted in, say, Georgia or Pennsylvania a school district there in, like, say, Atlantic Public Schools might be different than what it means to be gifted in, say, a rural Texas public school district or rural Oklahoma school district. The next thing that we looked at, and we kind of honed in on this a little bit more, was on universal screening. Now, one thing you might notice is determined by the LEA went way up. So only 7 states, or only a handful of states, said that we require this. The vast majority say that a school district can decide if they're going to universally screen or they're not. And one thing that I think about in these responses when I look at the difference between not required versus determined by the LEA is there overlap between the two there? Is there maybe a little overlap? So say, for example, determined by the LEA, are folks saying, well, that's not required, but the LEA can do it. So that's one thing to think about as well. So again, universal screening is something that advocates and that scholars support its use, but it's something that really hasn't had a lot of policy support yet at the state levels. The next section looked at the information about the gifted student population. So this, like I talked about, this is a lot of it is demographic information. It's about how many kiddos are enrolled in GT. And it looks at information on subgroups. Now, this is the important one. It's, does your state collect information on subgroups of students identified as gifted? So what does it mean about it? As you can see, the big chunk of them say, yes, we do require that. But one tricky thing to think about this, and for those of you who want to request information, to consider this, just because the state requests it does not mean that you have access to it as a citizen. Even if your state has Freedom of Information Act request, and almost every state does have Freedom of Information Act, or can exercise freedom of information. And one of the reasons why, even though this data exists, you might not have access to it is because of something in academia. The fancy term for it in academia is something called small area estimates. What does that mean? A small area estimate is where there's only a few kiddos in that category. So imagine this. So you want to request like a demographic breakdown of students identified as gifted. Now, I can tell you from the state of Texas collects that information. The state of Texas can tell you, collects how many students are identified as gifted by race, ethnicity. State of Texas can tell you that. But just because the state knows that doesn't mean they're going to tell you, because what ends up happening. So imagine a rural school district. And say you're trying to find out how many students of underrepresented population, students who are Black or students who are Hispanic, are identified as gifted. That district might only have one child who is Black and identified as gifted within the school district or within a certain grade level. And so that constitutes a small population. And the state would deem that it is not within that child's interest, it is a breach of that child's privacy to release that information to the public. So what ends up happening is masking, or they kind of hide that information. So for many people, they're always interested, wow, my state collects this, I want to know what's going on. So even if, I want to reiterate this, even if your state collects this information, doesn't necessarily mean that they will freely share it. The next section that we collected, let me go back on this. And if you want to see what your state's demographic totals are, those are again in the appendix of the State of the States report. And you might also notice that not every state reports those. That's because depending on the state, depends whether or not the person in charge of gifted has access to that demographic information. So in some states, the person in charge of giftedness has access exactly to who is and who is not gifted in the states. In other states, that information is held under another, say, office. And so for many of the people that we asked, they said, I have to request that. And then not only do they have to request it, then it might have to go up for approval. Like, can I release that information? So some of you flipping through the appendix might know, well, where's my state? They have it, they collect it. Why isn't it here? A lot of that times is maybe because the state wouldn't allow them to release it to us, or the person themselves did not have access to it. So they might know that the state collects it, but the gifted coordinator at the state level or whoever's in charge at the state level doesn't have access to that information to provide it to us. So even at the aggregate levels, so even at the statewide levels, they might not have that information or access to it. So the next section of the report looked at programs and services for gifted students, related policies. So this is like the service models, and you're going to see a common theme through here too that I'm going to talk about. Also, policies related to gifted services and state guidelines. That's an interesting one too that I'll talk about. So the first one is, and I like this, does your state have standards and guidelines? Yes, 23 do, 27 do not. And I want to highlight this one too, because I find this one interesting. Just because a state has standards and guidelines does not mean that the LEAs have to follow them. That's one really important thing to consider. The state might provide guidance and say, here are some standards that you should aspire to. I'll use an example, like here in the state of Texas, the state provides guidelines, standards, but the districts aren't required to meet those standards. They're meant as goals for districts to aspire to. Again, this is an area of a lot of local control. And one thing that I want to highlight and kind of point out to you guys as you read this report, and you think about this in total. Oh. And then here's the next one, state mandates gifted programming and options. Again, I want to highlight this. Just because the state says you must provide services does not mean that all services are the same, even across the states, or even within the state. Doesn't mean that services are going to be the same. So you will have a lot of variance across states on what gifted services mean. And then further, you're going to even have differences between what gifted services are within a state. Because again, there's a lot of local control here. There's a lot of determined by the local education agency. Checking my time, making sure I'm making good time and not getting too long-winded. So of the services, which is the big one? It should come as no surprise. Differentiation. That is the go-to service. You know, what are you doing for gifted kids in your state? Well, we're differentiating services. We're differentiating curriculum for them. We're differentiating them in the general classroom. Their general ed teacher provides differentiated services for them. That's a big one. Pull-out programs. It's pretty big too. Acceleration is one thing that's offered. AP and honors coursework. That's a big one. And probably the most universal gifted services in the United States, what we can think of as a universal service, are dual enrollments, dual credit. Those are, that might be considered, as I looked at the report and think about what is the universal service, dual credit. Dual credit AP. Those are universal service, and those have been adopted across the US, and that's, you'll find the same thing in 2018, 2019. That is, if we were to think of a primary service model for gifted education services, and you were to ask me what is the primary, I would say that. Even though we think of a lot of focus is put on like early ed or early elementary or elementary services, that is the universal service, is dual enrollment and AP. It's just every state said yes, except one. But the one that we looked at, we checked their website, they still haven't. So states that have an acceleration policy, only 13 do, or only 13 of the 52 respondents do. And again, I want to highlight this on this no. For those thinking about it and looking whether or not you're looking in the appendix. That acceleration policy, first of all, that acceleration policy can vary across the states. Just because two states both have an acceleration policy doesn't mean that they're the same policy. And no, just because a state does not have an acceleration policy does not mean that a child cannot be accelerated within that state. So the absence of an acceleration policy does not necessitate the absence of acceleration. And again, does the state has dual credit? Yes, determined by the LEA. Yes, we do. And 15 of them said determined by the LEA. So again, like I said, when I think, if you want to think of what a universal, like what the state of the states might provide as the universal gifted education service, like what is the one that might be synonymous with the entire US, is dual credit AP courses. So here we see services available by state. And one thing that you notice, and I like the colors here, the lion's share is like determined by the LEA. It's either not required or it's determined by the LEA. The districts can decide it. And like I said a little bit earlier, that's one of the big overarching themes that's available that you see in this report and in the previous report, is a lot of gifted education in general is very decentralized across the United States and within states. It's highly decentralized. But again, one thing that you can see where there's a big chunk, the three, where there is some requirements, are academic guidance, differentiated instruction, and required minutes of service contact time. But again, I'm going to say this again, and I want to reiterate it because I think that it's very important, because sometimes people misinterpret. Absence of requirement does not mean absence of service. I really want to highlight that, because there are states that have no requirement for GT, provide no services, no support for GT, but there are school districts within that state that still offers GT services. The next section looked at personnel and training requirements. This looked at the state requirements regarding pre-service teachers and professional learning requirements. So as far as personnel requirements, as far as gifted education administrator coordinator at the LEA level, most said no. And of those who said yes, the 14, only 4 required credentials in GT. So of our all respondents, 52, only 4 of the SEAs said that the person who is the administrator or the coordinator at the LEA level needs to have some kind of credential in gifted education. Now, what you think of credentials probably varies from person to person, but it is one thing to think about, especially if you're thinking in terms of advocacy, like an area of advocacy that you could focus on, or an area of advocacy that might be able to be, fruitful, is saying, there should at least be a person should at least know, to be in charge of gifted children within an LEA, they must at least have learned something about them first, had some kind of formal training about them. But you see, as teachers of gifted students, so here's an interesting thing, even though maybe the coordinator, it's probably likely that a coordinator was maybe a prior teacher, even though that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Again, there's a lot of decentralization in gifted ed. 23 mandate some type of training. 17 say, no, we don't require it. And 18 say, it's determined by the LEA. LEA just decides. So again, state required professional learning on gifted students. Only a handful say that this is required. 2, 2, and 3. The vast majority, as far as like your special ed, your counselors and administrators, the answer is no, or determined by the LEA. And so this is another area where, as far as like knowledge and area of focus of gifted education, there just isn't a lot of state mandates or state support for requiring administrators and counselors to have some kind of background in gifted education training. And that is something very synonymous across the US. We just don't require it. The next aspect we looked at, and this is an area of interest, is factors impacting gifted education services. And if you have been in K-12 in the past couple of years, I bet you can think of one of the number one big things that has impacted gifted education services. And I'm going to spend a little time talking about that. Talk in the report about local, state, and federal factors. We're going to talk a little bit more about issues of equity and excellence. I'm going to spend, and that'll be at the end of the report as well. I'm going to highlight these three things, and then I'm going to talk about them more towards the end. Issues regarding COVID-19, and then issues regarding ESSA. So of the states, we had 10 that say yes, that there is a policy or initiative to address equity and excellence. There is, but again, we had 44 respondents, so we're missing 8 respondents. But again, those 8 missing respondents doesn't necessarily mean that they don't, or that it's determined by the LEA. We can't necessarily know who those are or what their response might have been. We can maybe surmise, like say, for example, if the respondent said, we don't have any guidance on gifted education. The state, we don't have any mandate. And so it kind of can fall into reason that a state that has no mandate and provides no guidance on any gifted education services and takes a complete backseat might in turn also have no initiative or policy to address equity and excellence. So what are states doing to address it? Number one way is teacher training. That's a big chunk of what they're trying to do. So when you say, what are states doing in the US to address equity? Trying to train their teachers. The second one is using culturally responsive training and then alternative assessments. But the lion's share of what, if you were to ask any state randomly, say, what are you doing to do equity? It's probably going to do something with their professional development hours. Like say, for example, someone at the state is providing a training on identifying students from traditionally underrepresented populations or from marginalized populations. But this should be something positive that states, as a majority of states, majority of respondents, are aware of it. And this one, again, 36 respondents. This isn't 27 out of the 52. This is 27 out of 36. So again, we can probably say that the lion's share of states, the way that they're addressing equity is through professional development. The next area that I'm going to talk about, or that the report looks at, is funding. That's always a contentious issue. That's the amount of money, policies, how funds are earmarked, and if they even are. Funding specifically for universal screening, and funding to address the equity. So that's one of a couple of things that we added. So last year we, or the previous years, it's like, does your state provide funding? And what does that look like? This year we kind of wanted to know how much they're putting money towards, specifically earmarked towards equity, specifically earmarked towards universal screening. So if we look here, how many say that they have state funding to support gifted education? 26 do. Now, I want to highlight that and talk about that, because that I have found is a contentious issue. Again, when we say a state funds gifted education, what funding looks like in, say, Washington is different than, say, what funding looks like in Indiana. One state might fund based on average daily attendance. There might be some allotment that's associated with it. And another state might fund gifted education by some flat grant that is awarded to district, like some flat amount of money. Another state might award based on average daily enrollment or total enrollment rather than average daily attendance. You might have a state do that. You might have a state do matching funds. So the district spends X amount of dollars and the state agreed to match those funds to a certain percentage. So one thing to think about when you look at the state of the states report, and when you look at the section on funding, and when you think about it in terms of advocacy, when you think about it in terms of how gifted education is funded, is it needs to be approached with the understanding that every state goes about funding gifted education differently, but that's also because almost every state goes about funding education in general differently. Now, there are some few things that are kind of similar across states, like, for example, how title funds, or receiving title funds. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But as a whole, 22 states indicated that they have direct support for gifted education. But even of those that say we do not have any direct support, that doesn't mean that the state says you cannot use your general funds for GT. Lack of mandate or lack of direct funding does not mean that LEAs do not spend money on gifted education. And I'll use an example, even though I said I wouldn't. I'm not going to say which state, but there's a state that has no funding for gifted ed and hasn't had it for, what is it, for 29 years, almost 30 years now that they pulled it. And even then, without any support, there are still school districts within that state that provide services and that provide funding for it at the LEA level. So absence of funds at the SEA does not necessitate absence of spending at the LEA. And that goes with all these categories. So we have 4 states that say we give direct funds for universal screening. 12 states that say we fund for gifted program, and 8 states that say we provide funding for identification. So keep that in context. Again, for universal screening, just because the state doesn't provide earmarked funds does not mean that districts do not spend money to do it. So LEA reporting, we have 31 that say that it's required. That's one thing that you're going to get. You're going to have more states are more likely that you'll see are more likely to require reports from their LEAs than they are to give money to their LEAs. And I think that probably surprises nobody. Monitoring, you see that of the states, 21 don't, and of those, 28 do provide some kind of monitoring audits or monitor and audits. And I want to say again that a state that audits gifted education services or monitors is not the same. There are states who at random select which states or which programs they are going to audit. There are other states which audit on a rotation, like every 3 years we do an audit. There are other states who monitor. So it just depends. But one thing to keep in mind of, or an area of focus, if you want to think of like what my state can do, it's focusing on these neithers. So if you had to choose between like the model of like, we have a lot of school districts, we can't possibly audit them all, but they all know that there's a possibility of them being audited because there's a lottery, versus say not having anything, like having no accountability, you'll probably at least choose some sort of accountability method or some sort of accountability means. So again, plan approval and submission, we see 22 do. 15 have submission policies and 23 don't require anything. And again, these plans, I want to highlight this, and this is something I've reiterated over and over and over, because I really think that it helps to understand the context and to understand the results of the State of the States report. It helps to understand that each state is different and that each state provides some kind of slight differences. But like this shows that there are overarching approaches to gifted ed, which is, say, for example, you're required to submit your plan to the state. That's something that a lot of states think is a good idea. They might go about it a different way, but they think it's a little different, or they think it's a good idea as a whole. So here's what I want to explain. Let me check my time and make sure that I'm doing all right. So I'm going to speed this up a little bit so I can talk about things and leave some time for Q&A. I'm going to go to the 3 big things. Just real briefly. ESSA and GT. There are states who've said that ESSA has allowed new access to funds, title funds specifically. It's led to new policy. It's led to new policy. But one thing a majority, a lion's share said ESSA didn't do anything. And ESSA, that's just what that person believes, or as the representative of the state. ESSA might have done something at the ground level, but as far as the state is aware, or the person associated with GT at the state is aware, they don't know. Equity. I just want to highlight the first thing here. The LEA is the primary driver of equity. When we talk about who is driving equity across the United States, for many states, it's up to the LEA. That's who drives equity. Teacher training is the primary method which equity has gone about throughout the states. Universal screening is not a way that the states as a whole have endorsed as a way to solve issues related to equity. Now we come to the last thing, which is the effect of COVID-19 on GT. So this is the quote from Minnesota. I'll give you time to read this, about 10 seconds or so. And that response from Minnesota kind of sums up. I said I wasn't going to point out any states, but I thought this is a really good response from Minnesota. So what are some things we noticed? One, personnel was spread thin. And that was at the LEA level that the SEA talked about. And we experienced that collecting data at the SEA level. When we were trying to collect data, there were a lot of vacancies. There were a lot of people who said, well, I'm just in charge of GT now until we can hire somebody, or we haven't had somebody in a long time. Another thing that was pointed out with COVID and GT is less resources. All that determined by the LEA on funding. LEAs determined that GT wasn't a priority during COVID. That's what those LEAs determined. Here's another one that a lot of states mentioned, was issues associated with identification. It was hard when your kids are virtual, it was hard to ID them as GT, especially where those were states that used teacher nominations. There were a lot of states who mentioned that online delivery services were of suspect value as far as GT were concerned. And I don't think GT was alone in that as far as this phenomena with COVID. And the last one that I want to point out with, or to think about here with COVID-19 and GT, one big response is, we don't know. That was the majority response when you ask, what is the, well, the two big ones were issues associated with identification. The other one that we saw a lot of states saying is, we don't know what it is. We don't know the effect of COVID-19 on GT. Some might say, well, we don't know for certain. We haven't looked, but we suspect this. We've seen this trend. Like, we don't know what it is, but we've noticed that less students are ID'd as GT. We don't know what it is, but we've had more parent complaints about virtual services. We don't know, but we've heard from LEAs that the GT teacher is, having to do 3 different things. So that's one thing that was a really common response. So when you ask, like, how did COVID-19 affect GT? They don't know yet. And it's probably going to take a little while to kind of figure out what the ramifications are. And again, here are future directions. We want to further reduce. We want to really explore the COVID-19 pandemic and issues related to advocacy. And for more information, you can reach here. And with that, I'm going to leave it up here for any questions related to the report. And sorry to cut you off, give less Q&A time. The PowerPoint, I'm going to forward that to David, and then they'll be able to give out the PowerPoint as they see fit, or NAGC will. Yes, same thing with the slides. Again, I'm going to forward the slides to David, and then that'll be like under the purview of NAGC. And David, you can answer what's going to be done with the slides.
Yeah, we can send the slides out with a link to the recording in a couple days once we get all that cleaned up. So yeah, we will email that to you in the same email, using the same email address that you used to register for the webinar. And just a quick reminder, if you want to ask a question, just hit that Q&A button on your screen and type it, and we'll be able to see it on our end.
So here's one. Now that I've overseen the report for the past 2 cycles, are there any patterns or areas that you think will become more common in the upcoming states? So I really want to know what's going to happen with the personnel. So one thing that we heard that I worry about is those vacancies just aren't going to be filled. You know, there were a few states that said we have someone who's like, I'll use an example of a state who said that they've had a vacancy for 6 months. And it's just been that person retired and they just haven't filled it. And so what might happen is, or I worry, is those states might just decide, why fill this? It's been working. We don't necessarily need someone dedicated to someone dedicated to gifted education at the state level. We're just going to roll that under, say, secondary curriculum. We're going to roll that under special ed. And we're going to give the person in charge of special ed, we're going to say, GT's under you. So that's something that I worry about. As far as continuing theme, one thing that I'd like to see is this continued theme towards equity. You know, there's states, at least there's a general awareness of it, that something needs to be done with issues of equity. And I think you're going to see a continued uptick of state responses towards equity. One thing that looks to be something that we saw in the 2014, last time's report and this report is that funding is a pendulum. And it just depends on the state. There are always states that are saying we're giving more money to GT. And at the same time that there are states that are giving more money to GT, there are states that are cutting GT funding. So funding is one of those issues that just depends on the state and depends on the year, and it goes a little bit back and forth. The other thing that I think states are going to be wrestling with, and it's not just going to be GT, is the impact of COVID-19. I especially think, looking at some of the trends, if you want to know my personal opinion, that COVID-19 likely disproportionately affected students who are identified as gifted from underrepresented populations. So a lot of states were talking about lowered identification numbers. So I wonder if that lowered ID numbers, that lowered rated testing disproportionately affected students from marginalized populations. So I really wonder if we'll see the kind of tie-in between equity and between the effect of COVID-19. Differentiate. Do I think that's more effective than pullout? I think differentiation is cheaper and it's harder to assess. I think that's what it is. And I think it's easy to assess I think it's easy for an administrator to say, we differentiate. That's easy. You know, you say the general ed teacher differentiates. Do I necessarily think, so from my experience, based on my experience in K-12, and I would just draw from my experience and not necessarily my experience as a researcher, but I have seen very capable teachers differentiate on the fly. Those who have a lot of experience, they just are magicians with differentiation. They might not even know their differentiation. They just know if a kid's 2 levels above grade level, they have a good, set of toolboxes in their repertoire. So with a highly effective teacher, you might see differentiation being highly effective. But I tend to think that pullout programs are a more foolproof way to approach gifted education. We can see the effect of pullout in secondary. We don't call it pullout programs. We call it dual credit. We call it AP, or honors. I see the Kentucky one. So one of the questions about the funding, so that might be an error. And what you could do is, if you could email me, I could check back in the actual data. Let me actually look where you're talking about. Actually, go ahead and email me on that one, because I'll have to go and do a deep dive into the data and make sure that there wasn't an error on our part. So you might have caught an error that we didn't catch. Towards how could you move states towards? I think the way that I've thought about this and thought about the report a lot, if we want to say how we can move states towards supporting more GT, is to say, look at what providing universal services at the secondary level has done. If it's good for secondary kids to have GT services in the form of dual credit, if it's good to have GT services in the form of AP courses, and we consider that a benefit, why is it only secondary kids in secondary get access to GT? Why don't the kids in elementary get access to it too? That would be one thing that I would kind of point out, and one way that I would word it or kind of move towards advocacy. So the state that says we don't have any GT policies, what they usually mean is we don't provide services until they get into high school or until they get into late second or secondary. We don't provide elementary services. And you can say, well, if services are good for high schoolers, or if they're good for ninth graders, why aren't they good for seventh graders? Or why aren't they good for fifth graders? That's one thing I wonder about. You are right that there are unequal access to AP, and there are states. I know California is the poster child of, currently, and other LEAs of saying it doesn't work or there is inequity, so let's break it so we can hide it. And this is one of the ways that they're approaching it. Do I think that it's best? Clearly, I don't, because I'm in gifted education or I'm in gifted ed. I clearly don't think that that's the best approach, but some people do think that's the best approach. They think that that money spent on AP and dual credit could be better spent on early childhood services to kind of like Head Start programs and programs like early literacy programs to kind of catch kiddos up. Those folks might say that AP and dual credit is a big subsidy to those who already have. People who are more affluent are more likely to go into AP and dual credit. And so it's just a way for the state to give money to those who already have and to ignore those who might have been marginalized at the state level. I don't necessarily agree with that perspective clearly, but I have heard it. I went to an equity conference recently, and I heard it there. I will double check Washington State again. But one tricky thing I'll say for Washington in particular, and I'll mention that I know the same person answered it twice. It's the same person. So this isn't a case for Washington where it was a different person answering, but I will ask. And a lot of times what we do is we ask the person to verify. And one thing to think about, their understanding, even though it might be the same person, their understanding of that question might have evolved as situations change. Especially because for many of the folks, it was still a little bit during COVID-19 or the aftermath of COVID-19. But I see that it's 4 o'clock and I see that David just hopped on.
Here. All right, thank you. And thank you, Jaret, for this wonderful webinar and presentation. Really appreciate it. I believe, Jaret had his contact information up there along with my contact information. So if there are other questions, please feel free to send them our way. Appreciate everybody's time and your questions. Again, this presentation will be sent out to you in the next few days along with copies of the slides. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for attending today and hope everybody has a wonderful day.